Welcome to a Local 3 News special presentation, Michigan's Hidden History, honoring Black history.
I'm James Fillmore. This half-hour show is dedicated to the spirit of the Black community and its hidden history throughout the country and right here in Michigan. Local 3's Rebecca Bartlemate will begin with families of African descent who have made history in the Upper Peninsula.
Right here is the iconic Marquette landmark Gaines Rock. It was named after the Gaines family, who was well known because they were labeled as different for being a Black family in the Upper Peninsula in the 1850s. They lived around this area, which is why it's named after them. I went to the Marquette Regional History Center to learn more about William Gaines, his family, and what they did in the UP.
He was a former slave. He had been born in Virginia, and he was the son of the master and one of the female slaves. And when he was a young adult, his father freed him.
Once freed, William bought a slave from that plantation, freed her, and went on to marry her. His father then sent William to the copper country to work in the mines.
It appears that his father had some type of connection to the mines, probably an investment would be most likely. And William worked in the mines briefly but was injured. And following his recovery from his injuries, rather than going back into the mines, he came down here and worked as a coachman and a groundskeeper for Herman Ely.
William also worked for the Harlow House on 4th Street and did landscaping at Park Cemetery. William and his wife Mary also had 3 children.
Ida, Charles, and Ellen. And then Charles had a very large family. He had 11 or 12 children. For at least the first number of years, they were probably the only African-American family in the area. It was fairly unique to have an African-American family in Marquette.
Beth says that there are no descendants of the family living in the area now, but they do come back to visit. She also told me about another known family in the UP dating back to the 1780s.
There was a former slave couple on Mackinac Island. And they had been brought there as slaves and then were later freed. But this couple got married on Mackinac Island, and they lived there for a number of years. Once their children were grown, the parents, John and Marie, moved down to Detroit, but a number of their children and grandchildren stayed in the Great Lakes region.
They worked as fur trappers and fur traders.
And there's some evidence that they had intermarried with the local Chippewa community. And were living basically out in the hinterlands at that point, away from white society.
When we come back, we'll tell you about 2 Michigan Black communities and why they're no longer in existence. Welcome back to Michigan's Hidden History, honoring Black history. In the mid-1920s, there was an effort to create a Black community in Iron County. It was short-lived, and here is what happened.
The Upper Peninsula has a rich logging history, and in the mid-1920s, a group of about 35 African Americans came to an area near Iron River with the hope of working in the logging industry and living on that land. It was a colony called Elmwood,
with the understanding that they would do some logging and that they would be paid with the land to have their own community there.
But that's not what happened.
And eventually, within a couple of years, they were all driven out of town, and the community was basically destroyed.
Beth says that it sounds like Jim Crow laws, which were laws that enforced racial segregation, were used to force people to leave legally.
It sounds like, for the most part, they left the UP. Basically, law enforcement was trying to bring them up on charges and would basically say, we'll give you a one-way ticket home and not charge you if you leave, just to get them away from the community. So it was not a good situation. They were attempting to build a life here, and the community was not very welcoming.
This next Black community was torn apart to make an interstate in the 1960s. Ashley Graham from WLNS spoke with some people who were affected by this change.
The 11 miles that make up Interstate 496 were designed with one goal in mind: to connect people from all over Michigan. But that convenience came at a price for the tight-knit Black community already living there in the 1960s.
It was alive. It was like vital things were going on. Nowadays, we sitting out here, we don't see nobody. Everybody just driving by.
It was more of a family, so it was like breaking up a family a little bit. So
The project forced businesses to close after years of serving the Black community. Former residents still remember how important they were.
I'm standing in front of what used to be Johnny's record shop.
George Davis has lived in Lansing for more than 70 years. He says the record shop, which is now a paint shop, was a staple in the area for more than just music.
Johnny also sold clothes, like shirts and hats, and this is where we got some of our latest apparel, because this is the only place in Lansing that provided that kind of items for us.
Grocery stores, bakeries, medical offices, and churches, all gone in just a few years. The people they served had a choice to make: stay or leave. Some families found ways to stay close by. Adolph Burton's family was forced to move from his home on Logan Street and West St. Joseph Street when he was 16, where a ramp now sits. But his father found a loophole.
So he purchased a home that was going to get torn down in the path of 496 and put it on a truck and moved it on the north side of the street. We bought a vacant lot, and my sister still resides in that residence even today from 1965.
Others moved to different corners of the city. Barbara Baker lived near what is now Malcolm X Boulevard before her family moved to Lansing's north side. She says the main goal for most families was to stay together.
it was not uncommon to have your grandparents or your aunts and uncles living in the same block with you, because people just did that. So they moved, and then we had to move too.
City officials want to keep the memories alive through a project called Pave the Way, a partnership with the Historical Society of Greater Lansing. The project combines digital archives, an interactive map, and even a documentary to help people experience what the neighborhood was like. For some, it's a bittersweet idea.
Now, but for me, it is sad. I miss the neighborhood because it's kind of like a Leesburg to Beaver kind of neighborhood. Everybody knew everybody. Parents knew each other. Very low crime rate, and it was really, really a very, very nice community. It was just a way of life.
As we continue to explore African American history in Michigan, we'll look at an impact made at Michigan State University. That story when we come back after the break. One building at Michigan State University is home to what's known as the Game of Change. It was a step against racial segregation in college basketball. Audrey Dahlgren from our sister station in Lansing has that story.
When you walk into Jennison Fieldhouse, the first thing you notice is the track. It's also home to Michigan State's volleyball team. However, when it was originally built in 1940, it was strictly used for basketball. For 50 seasons, Michigan State's basketball program called Jennison its home, but this building will also forever be known as the home to the Game of Change.
College basketball would have eventually resembled what we see today, but it wouldn't have happened nearly as fast. We might not have had Texas Western beating Kentucky in 1966, but this game, the Game of Change in Jennison Fieldhouse, was a trendsetter, and it was the first time you've had a school from the SEC that would come forward and say, we'll play an all-black team.
The year was 1963, and the NCAA Round of 16 matchup featured the Mississippi State Bulldogs, an all-white team from the segregated South, versus Loyola University, a team whose starting five featured 4 black players, which was unheard of back then.
I give all the credit to Mississippi State coach Babe McCarthy, and his team had been the best in the league for years, but would not be able to play in the NCAA tournament because they wouldn't play integrated teams. And finally, he told his players before the season, if you win the championship again, we'll get you there, I promise. And that's exactly what happened. Guys splitting, going to different states, flying and meeting back here in East Lansing. And when they had the opening tip-off here in Jennison Fieldhouse, there were more flashbulbs going off just because it was black versus white.
The Bulldogs were banned by state legislative order from playing against an integrated team, which is why they had to sneak out of the state.
No one knew if there would be fisticuffs, if there would be tension, racial taunts. Didn't know what to expect, and instead they found Mississippi State to be a first-rate opponent and a team that they'd like to play anytime.
Loyola emerged victorious, topping Mississippi State 61-51, and would later go on to win the national championship that season, making an everlasting impact on not only the players, but the country.
The Mississippi State players didn't know what to expect when they went home. They said, oh, we lost. We're going to be met. We're going to get hatred. We're going to get hostility. Instead, they had a reception line from the airport all the way back to campus, people lining the roads, applauding them for what they had done, and the governor had to take a step back.
When we come back from the break, we'll tell you about one Michigan city and their influence on the Underground Railroad. Welcome back to our special presentation in honor of Black History Month. One downstate city has a lot of history involving the Underground Railroad. Luke Snyder from WLNS met with a historian downstate in Jackson to learn more.
As you walk down the streets of Jackson, take a closer look. You just might discover a significant piece of history with landmarks hidden in plain view. They tell a powerful story of bravery, perseverance, and freedom. Linda Haas is a researcher and author who's dedicated years of her life to studying the Underground Railroad. Today, our journey across Jackson begins at the actual railroad, at the Jackson train station. It's here where a slave named John White from Kentucky made his escape with help from a local, while being chased by a slave owner with a group of armed men.
He was smuggled on board at the freight station in a box or in a crate, and it would have been somewhere on this property that happened. And we do know that he did successfully make it to Canada. So the train outran the horses and he was able to make it, and I'm sure that the train itself factored into his escape just because of the speed.
Across the street from City Hall lies Bucky Harris Park, the site where 3 newspapers were founded by railroad agents looking to use their platform to speak out against slavery. The building was even burned down twice.
All that drama happened on this nice, quiet little park area, and that's part of why we celebrate this park today, because the newspapers were all a part of the anti-slavery effort through the information that they distributed throughout the community. It really helped to set the agenda for the people reading the newspapers.
If you look up at the park, you will see a painting with a star and a lantern, symbols that carried so much hope for those who searched for the light at the end of the tunnel.
If you were traveling and you saw a home with a lantern on at night, that was a sign that that house was usually friendly. A lantern on long after people had gone to bed.
The journey ends at Mount Evergreen Cemetery, where 7 Jackson residents, including a farmer, a judge, and everything in between, find their resting place. They helped free those like Emma Nichols, who escaped from West Virginia, and instead of making the trip up to Canada, like many others, she decided to make Michigan her permanent home.
She is someone who turned, I guess you could say, the chains of bondage into a wonderful livelihood, something that she could be proud of, she could support her family with, and left, I think, a very beautiful legacy.
Linda believes the courage these heroes showed should still speak to us today.
That it shows when people come together for a cause bigger than the sum of their differences, they can accomplish so much.
Still to come on our special presentation, Michigan's Hidden History Honoring Black History, we'll meet the author of a book written about people of African descent who have made contributions to life here in the Upper Peninsula. Welcome back. One Upper Peninsula woman did research about African descendants in the Upper Peninsula and even wrote a book about the area. We caught up with the author on her inspiration behind the book.
Dr. Valerie Bradley Holliday moved to the Upper Peninsula in the late 1980s.
I would get questions like, are you from Northern? Are you from the Bays? And most people, it seemed like women too, most women and people of color tended to seem like, well, unless you weren't a resident, well, you must be transiting to some other place. And I says, I wonder how many of people of African descent had been here, had made an impact.
And that's sort of how her book called Northern Roots, African-Descended Pioneers in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan began. But she didn't go into it with the idea to write the book. It was to answer her own questions, and she came across an interesting article that spiked her interest.
It was UP 200 midnight run sled dog race organization. And they had put this article out about Joseph Lafayette Smith. And he was a barber in Marquette. And he owned a business downtown. And as part of the winter carnival, he would invite people with their working dogs to do heats. And so they would race their working dogs that they used on their farms and whatnot. That's kind of how they got the inspiration for the midnight runs and that. So it's like, wow, African American person started, kind of initiated that, put that crystal on everybody's head.
Following that discovery, Valerie drove deeper into her research and went to places like the Census, the Mining Journal, NMU, Michigan Tech, a local photographer, and tiny museums and historical societies. She then found historical information on another person of African descent.
He was a World War II hero. Okay, so that's kind of out of the depth of where my book was.
Okay.
Sometimes you do have to work backwards, you know, backwards, forwards, and that. And they said his dad was from Munising. So he was an African-American World War II hero, and I'm thinking, wow, this guy's pretty cool. He could have left the field, but he didn't. I think he saved like 2 or 3 people because he did not leave the field when he was mortally wounded. He could have got treatment. So that was cool. So then I went and looked at his dad and came across this guy, Arthur Skinner. And Arthur Skinner was a lumber jobber. And he was born in Benzie, Michigan, but he has most lumber people. He followed the wood, you know. And so he went from Benzie to Dearton, which is up near Munising area and that. And he actually crossed that lake when there wasn't a bridge. He was apparently a very good lumber jobber. Art Skinner did pretty well. But he also knew the best way to treat his employees, feed them, and have a good like a family camp.
After about the 4th or 5th person that Valerie discovered, she realized that there was enough information for this 8-chapter, 119-page book.
The richness comes from making those connections with historians from, you know, like the, you know, library or university or that. And, you know, they may not have the absolute story about that specific person, but they can point you to sources. The other thing is, again, papers, newspaper articles, books if there are any, family members if there are any. There are historical societies too that help out a lot. And they help round, you start to see the individual in front of you. And they're no longer just a date or a birth date. They're actually, you know, you see them living, you know, in that environment as you learn more.
Reporting for Local 3 News, I'm Rebecca Bartlemay.
We hope you enjoyed this special presentation, Michigan's Hidden History, Honoring Black History. All of the stories we showed you tonight can be found on our website, upmatters.com. Thank you for watching. With Local 3 News, I'm James Fillmore, and have a good evening.